Here we go. Good morning and welcome to our second episode of Wetland Wonders. I'm Alyssa Yapel and I have my friends here from Old Woman Creek. And I'm going to quickly introduce, we have Janice Kearns with us and Emily, who they're going to be helping me with the Q&A today. So folks, please use your Q&A box if you have any questions. And then we have Jen, who is our presenter today. You might remember Jen from last week. So I just wanted to, last week Jen talked about why wetlands are wonderful. This week we are talking about bird migration and how birds use wetlands. And I just want to remind you that next week we will be talking about citizen science. So do you want to contribute to the health of your watersheds? What citizen science projects are out there that you can participate in? So we'll cover stuff like that next week. And don't forget, on Wednesdays, we have Ohio Bird's Eye. That's our webinar series with our friends from the Division of Parks and Watercraft. And next week, Kaylin Callender from Lake Hope State Park and John Hickenbottom from Salt Fork State Park are going to be talking about what fascinating creatures hummingbirds are and how you can attract them and create a hummingbird haven in your backyard. So with that, I'm going to let Janice and Emily quickly introduce themselves and explain what they do at Old Woman Creek, and then we're going to pass it off to Jen.
Excellent. I'm Janice Kearns. I'm the reserve manager here at Old Woman Creek up in Huron, Ohio. My primary responsibility is to oversee the facilities and the education and research program.
And I'm Emily Kuzmic. I am the Coastal Training Program Coordinator with Old Woman Creek. So essentially I do adult and professional education. I coordinate all kinds of trainings related to marine debris, stormwater management, species management and monitoring, erosion control, any kind of coastal issue, you name it. We work with a lot of different audiences as well as different partners, state agencies, nonprofits as well.
All right, and I'm Jen Buhite. I'm the education coordinator here at Old Woman Creek. You will see Emily again. She's our speaker next week, talking about all the cool citizen science programs she does. So I'm going to share my program with you. So we are talking birds. I heard from Alyssa that you guys are able to hear a lot about birds. We're going to talk about bird migration and why here in Ohio we see so many birds migrating through. We mostly see our migrations in the spring and the fall, but some of those birds hang around all summer. So today we're going to talk about birds and what makes them uniquely adapted for long distance migrations. We're going to talk about a couple specific species of birds that migrate to Ohio. You should be familiar with all of them, and we'll give you a little info about them. And the migration ranges for Ohio's migratory birds. Some of them are quite extensive travelers. How this helps Ohio and Ohioans, and how we can help the birds. So, what makes a bird a bird? I'm sure we all know this, but the number one thing is they have feathers. So if you see a bird, they don't all fly, but they should all have feathers. They have external hard shell eggs that they have to sit on to get to hatching and to have their young. They have specialized skeletons. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. Part of that specialized skeleton are their what some people refer to as hollow bones. So the top there is a bird bone and the bottom one is a human bone. Ours are very dense and they also have bone marrow in them. Bird bones aren't fully hollow, but they have these large air pockets that make them much lighter in weight than our bones to help them with flight. You don't want to be trying to fly through the air with heavy bones. And they are endothermic, which means they can control their body temperature like mammals. These geese have also extra down feathers on them so they can create layers of heat and heat the air in and amongst their feathers to help keep them warm. I am forever fascinated how birds can sit in water with ice flowing by them and be perfectly fine. All right, so parts of a bird, and these will help you if you want to do any birding. So if people, a lot of times people come in and say, I saw a little brown bird. What was it? Well, there's lots of little brown birds out there. So if you can ID different parts of the body of the bird, that helps us ID what bird it is. So the crown, so you'll hear, yellow-crowned warblers. There's lots of yellow warblers, so that's going to be my example today. But crown, top of the head, can be a distinguishing color or shape or have a distinguishing feather pattern on it. Obviously, the head, the beak tells us what birds eat. And we'll talk a little bit about that on our species that we look at today, but specialized beaks help them be specialized for what food they eat. The throat, often birds will have different colored feathers on their throat. That helps identify them. Their back, the breast, the wing. So different colors on the wings. Sometimes they have wing bars, which looks like a stripe pattern on their wing to help identify them. Their belly, their rump. So we also have a yellow rump warbler. Legs, so the legs are also tend to be specialized for what they do and where they live. And of course the tail, you can think about red-tailed hawks. They have very identifiable tail feathers. Bird skeletons are specialized as well. Skull is a skull. Eye sockets, if they're nocturnal, they'll tend to have large eye sockets. Great horned owls have very large eyes. If you extrapolated a great horned owl up to the size of a person, their eyes would be the size of grapefruits, and that's because they need those big eyes to see during the nighttime hours when they are hunting. So neck vertebrae, some birds have very long necks, some have rather short necks. Their digits for what we would call our hands would be in their wings, their arm bones. The furcula, the wishbone, is a specialized skeletal. It's a fused collarbone there to help stabilize them. The keeled sternum, that provides extra surface area for the breast muscles to adhere to. Especially if it's a flighted bird, they need to have obviously very strong breast muscles, and they need extra surface area to attach to. Tail vertebrae, so that they can move that tail. Some birds, like woodpeckers, they use that tail as almost like an anchor on the tree, so it needs to have vertebrae in there that makes it mobile and movable. Their legs and their leg bones, and their toes and claws. So if you think about some birds, like our water birds, have webbed feet because they need to be able to paddle and swim in the water. Our wading birds tend to have very long, skinny toes and claws, and our birds of prey tend to have very strong talons on them to help them get their prey. All right, so we're going to look at the size of migrating birds and how far they travel. And first, we're going to talk a little bit about why birds migrate. So, we always hear the old adage, birds fly south in the winter. And it's not just because they're cold, right? We've already talked about some birds can withstand the cold. They can regulate their own body temperature. So we're going to be talking about long distance migrators. The ones that are typically wintering in Central and South America, some in the Caribbean, and then some are in the US and Canada. And the reason that they migrate is they're moving from areas of low or decreasing resources to areas of high or increasing resources. So it depends on what your food is, but a lot of birds eat insects, seeds, nectar from flowers. So as we are moving from winter to spring, the southern hemisphere is moving from fall to winter. So those birds are going to move away from the decreasing food population north, where it's getting warmer and we're having more plants bloom, which brings around more insects, which can move right on up the food chain. If you're a birder, or if you're interested in birding, you might have heard of the biggest week in American birding. It's typically the first full week in May. It wasn't as populated this year because of travel restrictions, but some years you can get hundreds of people a day, and literally from all over the world, all over the country, and they come to Northwest Ohio along the shores of Lake Erie because we have some great birds migrating through. And this is a common scene during that week up along the lake. So here's a little map. McGee Marsh is the Division of Wildlife property that's there, and they have a nice birding boardwalk trail out to through their wetlands and out to the lake. And next door, although it's not on this map, is Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, which is a federal property that also provides some great birding in that area. So now we're going to talk about why they come to Lake Erie. So the birds travel on 4 main flyways as they're migrating from the Caribbean and Central and South America. You can see there's the Pacific Flyway to the west, the Central Flyway, which kind of skirts around the Rockies there, the Mississippi Flyway, and the Atlantic Flyway. Now, it's small on this map, but if you can find Lake Erie, and I will help you, you will see that we have the convergence of those 2 eastern flyways, which is why we get so many migrating birds through that area, because 2 of those flyways are going right through. Last week we talked about wetlands, and part of the reason why the birds like to fly through this area is there are wetlands along the shores of Lake Erie. We did talk about how in Ohio we've lost 90% of our wetlands. That's why we are the lightest shade of green there. But they still, we still have quite a few in that area, and they provide good resting habitat and good food sources as the birds take that final journey across the lake and up into Canada. So they're looking for a snack and a resting spot before they go across the lake. The lake, though Lake Erie is one of the smaller ones, it's still a big barrier for them to traverse, especially on the back end of their long travel. So we're going to go through some specific bird species now and talk about how far they fly. So these all of these species should be familiar to you. This is the ruby-throated hummingbird. We're going from smallest to biggest for today, and these little guys weigh 1/10 of an ounce, so 0.1 ounce, and they only measure about 3 inches in height. So I have 7 Q-tips here. This is the weight of a hummingbird. This is just a replica, is the size of their egg. This little guy here, it's just bigger than a Tic Tac. So little birds, and they measure about 3 inches in height. So real small birds that travel quite a long ways. So you can see here on this map that they winter, our winter, their non-breeding season is typically in Central America. There's a little bit in Florida, Southern Florida and the Florida Keys, and then they migrate all the way up into the United States and some into Canada. So that's a long flight. We know these guys eat nectar, and that's why hummingbird feeders are so important. I won't get too into it since there's a whole webinar next week about it, but having those hummingbird feeders really gives them some extra nutrients along the way to make it to their final breeding location. The Baltimore Oriole, real pretty bird. It weighs about the same as 7 pencils. So just a little over an ounce, 1 1/4 ounces, and it measures about 7 inches here. So this one is our Baltimore Oriole, measures about 7 inches. Not real big. You look at its beak. These are another one of our sugar junkies, kind of like the hummingbird. So a lot of people will put out fresh fruit for them. They do like fruit. Oranges are popular. It's a nice bright color, so it attracts them. It has been found that they like ripe fruit. So red grapes and ripe blueberries would also work for them as well. And they have a similar track, except they can winter all the way down in Ecuador. You see at the tip of South America there, and then in the Caribbean as well as Central America. And then they migrate north, and then their breeding is in mostly the northern part of the United States and maybe a little bit into Canada. These guys are really fun to see. The males are nice and brightly colored, and they have a really pretty song as well. Right, red-winged blackbird, maybe not quite as favored as the oriole, certainly in its call, but this is a bird I truly identify as being one of our wetland birds. If I'm out there and I don't hear or see a red-winged blackbird, I feel like I didn't spend a day in the wetland. So they weigh around 1 3/4 ounces, which is about 20 cotton balls and 5 pencils. So still pretty lightweight bird. This is a male. You've probably seen them. They have those red epitaphs on their shoulders, and they will get puffed up and make them bigger and more red to be seen. These can be pretty aggressive little birds. They will dive bomb you. They're about 7.5 inches, so not that much bigger than the oriole, but much feistier. If you get too close to their nest, they will let you know, or their entire territory. But they are ubiquitous with the wetland and a great wetland species. Their habitat and range has expanded, so you can see that here they can do year-round in lots of places. They're breeding in more of the northern parts. And then they spend some wintering months in looks like western Mexico. But great bird. Again, when I hear them come back in the spring, I'm always happy. All right, the belted kingfisher. So this guy has a very different beak than the other ones that we've looked at. It's also a little bit bigger. It's about 5 ounces, which is about the size of a small can of food. So still not increasing in weight in a lot, but they are increasing in size. This one is the kingfisher, so they're about a foot, from the tip of the beak into the tip of the tail. And if you look at their beak, they're eating fish. So what these guys do is they'll swoop down, grab a fish out of the water, bring it back up to a perch, and they kind of will knock the fish around until it stops wiggling, and then they'll swallow it. Again, these guys will typically let you know if they're out on the estuary or if you're in their wetland, and they'll do some flybys and give you. They have a real fast staccato call that they'll shout out at you, letting you and everybody know that they know that you're there. These guys do non-breeding in Central America, the Caribbean. You can see they're pretty widespread there. Some will spend all year in a good part of the United States, and then breeding in Canada on some of the northern United States. So ours came back pretty early this year. I think I heard them in February. We did have a warm February this year. Ours typically do not winter with us, so they do migrate. The wood duck is my favorite waterfowl. Not as big as a mallard, but still the biggest bird we've seen so far. This is the male. They are very brightly colored, as in with many birds. The males tend to be more brightly colored and the females tend to be more muted. These guys weigh about 2 pounds, like a nice little hand weight here. And they are about 20 inches. And we're talking again, tip of the bill to tip of the tail, where you can see that they're about 20 inches in height. They have breeding up in the northern parts, non-breeding towards the west, and year-round. Again, ours migrate, and they typically come back in the spring. This one is one that the gray blue heron has. Many people come here and associate this with us. We had a Heronry start up this year, and I have a couple pictures from that. Basically, they moved in and did colonial nesting to hatch their eggs. It's the first year we've really had this, so we're hoping that they come back again next year to their new Heronry. So these guys, 5 pounds. I have a little paver or a brick here. This is about 5 pounds. Real tall. They are about 3 feet. So the whole yardstick here. So they have long necks. They're obviously wading birds. They have long necks, long feet. They stand very still and wait for something to swim by. Typically it's fish. You can see their beak again. It's for fishing, but they will also eat amphibians, small snakes, kind of whatever swims by them, maybe a crayfish here and there. Our wood ducks, which I forgot to mention, are plant eaters. They're herbivores, so they're eating water plants, and they have that flat bill, so they can like get the water out and siphon the plants through. Gray blue herons have expanded their range as our temperatures changed due to climate change. Birds and plants will and animals will adjust their ranges as well. I think we did have some herons that stayed all year this year, so you can see that there are year-round populations through a good chunk of the United States, except where we have mountain ranges out there in the west. And then they do some breeding up north if they are still on the migratory path. Although, as we know from around here, that there are plenty of herons that are breeding in this area as well. So our Heronry this year, this is a picture of it. Earlier in the spring, we had about 40 nests. They do like trees. These are dead ash trees, so they won't have any leaves on them. I know in Cuyahoga Valley National Park, they like the sycamore trees. Those leaf out late in the spring, so they can fly in and fly out unimpeded by leaves. They're, you know, they're not the most graceful bird when landing. They got those big wings and those big legs, long legs, so they kind of just fly in there. So that's why they don't like to have too many extra leaves around. So you can see some are in their nest, some are standing off to the side. This picture was taken last week. There is still a young one in this nest. I think last week we had maybe just 1 or 2 left that hadn't fledged yet. So, you know, their nests are not as intricate as an eagle's nest, but it does well enough for them for when they need it. All right, so what bird migration means to Ohio. So I have pictures here. McGee Marsh, we mentioned, that's their birding boardwalk trail. I mentioned Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. That's the picture in the bottom right. Old Woman Creek, you can certainly come and paddle or use our trails to see birds as well. But because we get so many birders from around the country and around the world, they bring lots with them. So each year, upwards of 80 to 90,000 birders will flock to the western basin of Lake Erie, typically in that first week or 2 of May. There are lots of digital sites where people, you know, will post what they saw. If it's on your list, then you haven't seen it. People will run out and try and see those birds. Many birders make the trek every year. So it is actually very important to the economy in that area. In fact, birders spend nearly $40 million each year in local businesses. So, you know, hotels, restaurants, shops, state parks, national parks, wildlife refuge, all those sorts of things. And it creates jobs. It's estimated to create about 280 jobs just from birding alone. So the fact that we are in that flyway crossover is really important ecologically and economically to Ohio. So it's in our best interest to help the birds. So what can you do? Well, you can feed birds. You can always put up feeders. Birds will always take a free meal. Some times of the year, it's more advantageous for them than others. So early in the spring and late in the fall, having some extra food out that is different from what they might be able to still scrape out in nature is super helpful to them. You can see the cardinal on there. That's one that's going to stay all year, as well as the black-capped chickadee, which is on the top right there, and the goldfinch. They're one of our migrators, so they're not here all year. You can support places that put up bird feeders, and if you don't want them in your yard, you can always go visit someplace like Old Woman Creek or other nature centers that have bird feeders up, and you can see what you find and check birds off your list just by sitting inside. It's also a nice way if someone isn't able to go walking on birding trails. It's a nice way to bird by just watching. You can also support places that support bird habitat. So visiting protected areas that provide bird habitat and places for you to view them is important as well. And in the winter time, we talked about food, getting food out for birds, and especially during those super cold times or super extended cold times where it gets really dry, you can keep fresh water that isn't frozen out for birds. So I know my mom has a bird bath, and you know, during the winter she'll just change it out every day. And we here at Old Woman Creek, in this picture, we have a pond heater in our ponds so that the fresh water is available to the birds. They don't get dehydrated. They can't really utilize snow for their hydration purposes. So that's a really important one. You know, when we get those polar vortexes or just extended cold periods where the natural water will be frozen and inaccessible to them. Really important. And last, we're gonna advise that you keep your cats safe and sound inside your house. I know that cats often look out the windows and seem like they want to go outside, but it is much safer for them to be inside. There's no fear of them getting hit by a car or getting parasites or diseases. And they are the #1 threat to birds. So cats are known to kill not just for food. If you are a cat owner and you've had an outdoor cat, you may have been left what some people call a present or a prize by your cat. They'll leave you a bird or a small mammal, but they didn't eat it, right? So that animal had to be sacrificed not for food purposes. In fact, cats kill 2.4 billion birds a year. Some birds are really struggling, and in places like Florida or where we have birds that are endangered, this can be even more detrimental to those bird populations than they are here. But still, 2.4 billion is quite a few birds. So keep them indoors. They can still be entertained with windows, and they can be friends with the birds from afar. And that way our birds and our cats will be safe. I think that concludes my presentation, but we're happy to take any questions if anybody has them about birds or birding or bird migration.
Yeah. So Jen, Mike wrote in and asked, what kind of migration occurs in Europe, Africa, and Asia? So I don't know. Uh-oh, I saw your eyes get big.
Well, they have similar flight paths. I don't know the where each one of them are in Europe or Asia or Africa, but birds do fly similar patterns every year. So a bird is going to go the same route every time.
Okay, and you touched on this a little bit, but Barb asked, does Old Woman's Creek host bird watchers during the bird watching week? So you did talk about, you know, how many birders come up, but could you maybe expand on, are there hosted bird walks or volunteer avian monitoring programs? Emily had mentioned that. I just thought, you know, could you expand for the rest of the viewers to hear?
Sure. Yes. Typically, we do have a couple of things planned for that week. Hikes. Typically, if you want to see the birds, you need to get out a little earlier in the morning. And I didn't mention this, but it is but Old Woman Creek is a nice place to come if you don't want to battle the crowds at McGee Marsh or Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. We will typically see a lot of the same birds, but with a lot less people around to kind of fight off for that good spot for viewing. So we do offer them. Typically, we do have hikes and some bird programs around that time of the month. And then, Em, you want to talk about monitoring?
Sorry, let me unmute myself. Yeah, so you guys will hear more about this next week and the different monitoring programs that we have at the reserve, but 3 of them are actually avian, no, 4 of them. So half of our monitoring programs are avian related, but the one that I most actively recruit volunteers for is our general avian monitoring program. So typically when we're hosting in-person events, we have guided hikes, you know, 1 or 2 times usually throughout the year, one in the spring around the biggest week of American birding, and then one in late summer. Usually our seasonal intern will lead it. Again, things look a little bit different this year, but we're happy to work with volunteers to either come out on the trails and do a social distance hike to teach them the point count protocol that we use, or if you send me an email, we'll drop a link to our contact information in the chat box. I can send information electronically. So we have citizen science initiatives where anyone can come and sign up for free and, you know, contribute to science with their recreational hikes at the reserve. And then we're getting a couple more questions, so I'll let that.
Yeah. Yeah, Emily, if you want to answer any while you're on the screen, I don't know if there's some that you want to take, and if not, I could put Jen back up. There's a lot of great questions here.
Yeah, we could probably tag team a little bit. So the one I'm looking at is, how do birds fly over large bodies of water manage that? How do they rest and eat? From, again, the knowledge that I have, and Jen and whoever, feel free to chime in. There are lots of different species that rely on, obviously, diet and stamina. So they are able to fly very long distances. As Jen mentioned, they have hollow bones, so that definitely helps them, you know, go further than, say, perhaps, you know, a mammal might be able to travel in a day or a night. Something that I did want to bring up that's pretty related to this is a program called Lights Out. And there's a couple of different cities that operate with this program. It is another citizen science volunteer program, and it's raising awareness about turning skyscraper lights off at night because that causes a lot of bird collisions. And with birds, especially migrating over large bodies of water, such as the Great Lakes, cities like Cleveland that are on the Great Lakes, and they have these skyscrapers without turning off their lights, we get a lot of collisions. So they do rely on the shoreline and having those stopover habitats so that they do have the stamina to continue across large bodies of water, and that's one program that is addressing that. Another question is, are there any limitations to what you can do at Old Woman Creek because of the pandemic? I'd like to visit soon. So actually, I'm going to give that one to Jen because she is our visitor center guru.
All right. So our trails are open sun up to sundown every day. So if you do want to come visit, that's a good way to do it. We have a couple different trails that go through our different ecosystems, upland forest, along the wetland, and through our meadow area. And you can see the different birds that live in those different habitats. Unfortunately, we aren't able to offer in-person programming this year or access to our visitor center as of yet, but we will keep everyone updated via the internet, and through our friends group helps us with social media so that we can post, when we get updates to those things. I did want to jump back to the flying over large bodies of water. So if you are interested in bird migration, you can, in the springtime, follow the birds as they migrate north. Sometimes the birds migrate north in such large numbers that you can see them on radar maps. And so in April and May, you'll see a lot of those birds coming across the Caribbean. And they do the Caribbean typically in one night if they can make that push from Mexico or Central America, and they'll go across the Gulf of Mexico. They do that push in one night. They have to get lots of food beforehand, and then they'll rest when they get to the southern shores of the United States and stock up on more food. So bird habitat, not just up here in Ohio in the wetlands, but bird habitat all along the way is really important for them to be able to make their journey. Having enough wild spaces with enough food and water that they need to make that journey is super important. So protecting those areas all throughout the United States is a priority for bird migration. So, and they typically like to fly at night too. Sorry, I forgot that part. And that's because there tends to be a little less wind at night because we don't have those, those temperature changes as the day heats up and the water around the world heats up. We start getting our wind activity throughout the day. So the birds will often fly at night. But it's cool. You can Google bird migration on radar, and you can see these big masses of birds flying through the Caribbean on the radar maps.
Okay, so a few more questions. If you get a permit online, can you kayak at Old Woman Creek this summer?
Yes, so the permit is on our website. If you go to our website, you will see it says Get Preserve Access Permit. It's a green rectangle button right in the middle of the page. So you'll open that up. It'll come with our kind of rules and guidelines. You fill out the form and email it to the email listed on the form. And then the person handling preserve access permits for all of Division of Natural Areas and Preserves will email you back your permit. If you can print it off and put it on your dash of your car, then you can come up on the day that it says on your permit. From sunup to sundown is when you can access the water via the permit. And yeah, you should be all set. So if you have any questions about it, shoot me an email or give us a call. But this was kind of our way to give access to people when we weren't in the office this year. And it used to be you had to come in and fill out a paper permit by hand every time you wanted to go out. So given the pandemic and lack of access to staff people to help with that, we moved it to an online format.
Awesome. And Dave wrote in and asked, are there eagles and hawks at Old Woman Creek? Do they migrate?
Yes, there are eagles, and we do have some hawks. We tend to not see as many hawks, and I don't think we've ever studied this, but I think we all kind of pontificate that this is because we have so many eagles, and they're the top. They're the top of the food chain, right? So they're the biggest, baddest bird in the neighborhood. Every once in a while, we'll see a Cooper Cooper's hawk using our bird feeders to eat themselves because they eat small birds. And every once in a while an osprey will fly through, but again, we don't have those open nesting areas that they prefer. And I think the eagles kind of rule the area. Some eagles migrate, some don't. Same with hawks. They're big, kind of beefy birds, and they can withstand our a little bit warmer winters that we've had.
Okay, and then now I think I have a good sense of direction, but probably not as good as a bird does. But someone had asked what happens if the bird gets lost when it migrates. So does that happen?
Not typically. Birds are, born with that kind of innate map kind of imprinted on them where they need to go. I mean, they can, if there's a storm, that can really disorient birds. If they get interference from light and buildings, that can disorient them. And if they get injured. So basically, if any of those things happen, they have to try and make it the best they can that year and kind of make the best out of the situation wherever they land, and hopefully they can find their way back to their non-breeding area and try again the next year. I mean, not all birds that migrate are going to make it through the migration. They do lose a lot each year. It's a long trek, and there are lots of hazards for them, and that's why we try and let people know about, like Emily said, with the lights, so we don't get those collisions with buildings. We see collisions with cars on the side of the road. You see geese and birds of prey on the side of the road. Telephone wires and wires and other kinds of wires, electrical wires, can be tricky for birds as well. They can collide with those. So there are lots of hazards. They typically do pretty well in finding where they need to go, just because it's part of their instinct. But they can hit bumps along the way. Hurricanes are another one that really disrupt migration, and as hurricane seasons get earlier or start earlier and earlier each year, that could potentially bump into migration season.
Okay, so we had some questions too about if people can watch this back, so I just wanted to kind of touch on that before we wrap up today. So Jen, I guess you're out of the hot seat now. But thanks for the presentation, and thanks Janice and Emily for joining and helping with questions as well. We will be back for another episode of Wetland Wonders next week. Like I mentioned, we'll be talking about citizen science. I did want to touch on, now Jen mentioned what you can do, including putting up bird feeders. So if you do want some more info on bird watching and attracting birds, Lauren Broderick and Kara Freemark, who are two of our naturalists, did a wonderful presentation last week as a part of our Ohio Bird's Eye webinar series. And that was kind of a beginning birders webinar series, how to be a birder. So they talk about what kind of binoculars you need and what kind of seed is best to put in feeders. So if you do want to know a little bit more about attracting birds, I suggest you check that out. The link is the first thing I posted in the chat tonight. It's our YouTube page, OhioDNR videos, and you'll be able to find it there. But thanks for joining us. There were some awesome questions, and we look forward to seeing you next week, Thursdays at 12. Bye.